Hi, this is Barry, and welcome to the Simplicity Zen podcast. If you're watching this on YouTube and you could take a moment to like, subscribe, and possibly comment on the video, that those type of metrics help the YouTube algorithm share this with more people. And sometimes I ask people to do it in the videos, and sometimes I don't. And I notice when I ask people to do it and people do it, it's interesting how much more the video is shared with people on YouTube's algorithm. So if you could do it, I would appreciate it. Thank you. If you're watching this on the podcast networks, which is I think is the vast majority of our listeners at this point, you can and you want to get alerted to new episodes, you could go to simplicityzen.com, and then there's a form there to sign up for the newsletter. And I admit I've not sent that out for a while, but I'm committed to start doing it pretty much this month. Today, my guest is Stephen Slottow. He's a longtime Zen practitioner and a professor of music theory at the University of North Texas. He was a professional fiddler and banjo player and is author of a book on the Americanization of Zen Chanting, which we'll discuss today. And here's the book. It's last I checked, it's sold out on Amazon and other booksellers. Do you know anywhere where people can buy it at this point?
It's actually out of print.
Okay.
Because the editor, Pendragon Press is a small press, and the editor slash publisher died, and no other publisher would take their list, mainly because they insisted it was written into the contract that the authors had more rights than usual to their own work, and other musicology, music theory publishers didn't like that clause. So it's actually out of print now. There is another publisher who would like to add it to their list, but they're a very, very expensive academic press. So if you want it now, you either have to find used copies, or I have still 8 or 10 copies in my closet. You can get it from me.
And you're easy to access on Facebook and so forth.
Yeah.
Or probably through your faculty page on the university.
Yeah, just go to the College of Music, University of North Texas.
Did you write this book for a course, or was it a thesis? What was the genesis of the book?
Neither. Well, the book has a sort of long, uneven genesis. Back when I was doing graduate work at the City University of New York, which in Manhattan, I was, well, I've been a musician and interested in music for as long as I can remember. So, of course, when I got into Zen, which was at the Rochester Zen Center, was the first formal place, and did a workshop where you, not a workshop, a training session. I think it lasted 3 weeks. And we had chanting practice. And it was very interesting to me to hear how they were talking about chanting and how they were doing it. They weren't using any kind of specialist language, but sort of specialist things were happening. And so I've always been interested in viewing Zen chanting as music. And then when I was in New York, I was going occasionally to a Zendo on Washington Square. What was it called? The Village Zendo. And there was a guy named Robert Savage who was he was studying composition under David Del Tredici at Columbia, but he was also studying Zen with John Daido Loori. And he evidently had a very close relationship with Daido. I think he pretty much viewed him almost as a son. And he seemed to be pretty advanced in his practice. And I recall after a sit, I was talking about, I was interested in Zen chanting as music. And he said, Zen chanting isn't music. I was thinking, well, what is it? Because I'm used to thinking of music as sort of in the John Cage sense, as music is organized sound. which is a pretty broad definition, you know. He said Zen chanting isn't music. And I think he was thinking it's part of a religious practice. It's a component of religious practice. It isn't music. And this immediately reminded me of a kind of Orthodox Islamic view of music. The stricter, more Orthodox, I don't know that much about all the various Islamic sects, but there's this view among the stricter sects that music is a frivolous secular thing. And like the call to prayer, which I would think of as a musical thing, it's certainly organized sound and it has its own style. That can't be music because that's a sacred thing. And I kind of felt that Robert Savage was coming from the same place. And I thought, well, there's a long tradition in Western music between religion, Christianity, and what they called music. They didn't call it not music. I mean, people written masses and motets and hymns and for religious services. And, Bach's cantatas are music, but they're also part of a religious practice. So I thought, that's an odd answer. It's a curiously conservative answer for Robert Savage. So that sort of planted the idea in my mind. Then later on, when I was looking for something else to write and hopefully publish about, Bob Kessler of Pendragon Press said, do you have any other ideas? I'd already published one book with him on an American composer named Carl Ruggles. And so I trotted out this Zen chanting idea, which is sort of still in the back of my mind, sort of irritating me at odd intervals. And to my surprise, is that sounds interesting. If you're interested in doing that, tell me and we'll proceed. So I did, and I got a contract, and it wasn't for a course. You can't teach a course in Zen chanting in North America. It's too specialized. You can teach a course in Buddhist chanting, but that's a wide topic, and I certainly don't know that much about the Buddhist chanting, and I haven't been a participant in through my own Zen practice. So that's how that came about. And I was just thought, well, if I'm going to have to come up with a manuscript, I may as well kind of look into all of the little things I've had questions about. That started with that conversation with Robert Savage.
So I have a lot of questions about chanting in particular, but before we get to that, I'd like to maybe talk a little bit about your practice journey, to give people kind of context of who you are and why we're here and so forth. So where did you grow up?
By the way, I'm tempted to say, since your Simplicity Zen has now become so famous, I'm tempted to say, God, I'm so thrilled to be here. But I'm not going to say that because that would be gauche.
Yeah.
So now that I've got that out of the way, say your question again.
Oh, where'd you grow up?
I was born in Baltimore, but I grew up in Urbana-Champaign, Illinois.
How would you characterize the scene where you grew up in? Did you grow up in a conservative, liberal, religious, non-religious, artistic, engineering? Like what was kind of the scene in your household?
Different aspects. My father was on the faculty, electrical engineering faculty of the University of Illinois. In fact, he was one of the three inventors of what was called the plasma display panel. And for a while, you could get plasma TVs that use that technology. He was also a jazz pianist. He played by ear. He didn't read music very well. He had studied jazz piano in Chicago, where he grew up, and He was very good.
Hmm.
He played usually rhythmically freely because he usually didn't play with anyone else. They had a great harmonic sense, a good technique. So a bit of engineering, although I wasn't interested in engineering. Um, a lot of music. Um,
Can I ask you a question? Actually,
my family, what?
I want to ask you a question about that. When he played, what is the context of a harmonic sense when you're playing solo? Because I always thought about harmonic is how multiple parts resonate together. And so when you said it had a good harmonic sense, like what was
Harmony are chords and chord
okay?
progressions, and
Uh-huh.
on uh, on the piano or any keyboard instrument, especially, you're playing tons of chords
Yeah.
because it's a multi-voiced
Hmm.
instrument. On a saxophone, you're playing less chords, and so he played very sophisticated harmonic stuff.
Hmm.
I don't know where I got that. Maybe that he did have it.
Hmm.
Now, as for religion, my family were Reform Jews, which is so Reform is kind of the lightest layer. There's sort of Reform, and there's conservative, and then there's Orthodox. We were on the Reform side, but we did go to the temple
Hmm.
um once a week,
So
and
you
we
learned Hebrew and have bar mitzvah and all that kind of stuff.
I never had a bar mitzvah.
Really?
Uh,
That's not fair.
I both my sister and I kind of were bored to tears by Sunday school. Um, and we rebelled. We were revolting. We revolted. Uh, and we refused to go any longer. Um, and that was, I don't know how old I was, but it was before bar mitzvah age.
Hmm.
And it was only afterwards that I realized if I had just learned a little bit of Hebrew, I could have had a bar mitzvah and people would have given me money and gifts and, and thrown me a dinner and all that. I said, God, I could have raked the moolah in if I just stuck it out a bit longer. But it was, I'd made my stand, and
Hmm.
so I still am not a man. I'm just a
Yeah.
boy.
Well, have you done Jukai?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
So
twice.
we'll count that then
Uh,
as your manhood
okay.
initiation.
We'll bend the rules a little bit.
Okay. Um, did you have any sense of a greater power, or did you believe in God? Were you a rationalist? How would you characterize your view of reality as a kid and young teenager, or did you just not even think about it?
It's hard to put in those terms. Also, my memory is not as good as it was. Um, but what was really important to me is that I had a kind of sense of the imminence of things when I was growing up until I was about 14 or 15. That is, I could see landscapes. I mean, really see them. The feeling in a landscape, or the feeling in an old house, or I mean, I was really alive to the sense of things. Things were not flat and out there, things
Hmm.
were vibrant and alive. And especially after I read Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, which was like a pivotal book. Well, three books, but he conceived it as one book,
Hmm.
and indeed one book which is just the top end of his whole mythology. Um, Especially the episode where the Fellowship has escaped from the mines of Moria and go to Loth Lor, Lor, Lor,
Lothlorien.
Lorien,
Hmm.
where Galadriel and Celeborn takes them in. And the thing about Lothlorien is that due to the power of one of the three rings that Galadriel wore, everything was like super alive, super vivid. There's
Hmm.
this passage where Frodo puts his hand on the trunk of a tree. They're going to go up the tree because they're going to go to a flat to meet. Uh, and he was vividly, like amazingly aware of the life of the tree. And
Hmm.
after that, especially, I was I was in an Explorer Scout troop, and we would take we'd go on trips to the Rocky Mountains or the Tetons, or and go on long hikes, like week-long hikes. And I was very aware of sort of the life in the landscape.
Hmm.
The Lord of the Rings seemed to heighten that. And
I
so
really resonate with that. Yeah.
um but then everything crashed before, I think in my junior year, everything sort of blanked out, and that sensitivity to the world just sort of flattened out. I'm not sure why. And I guess the rest of my life has been an attempt to sort of come back to life as best I can. That
Hmm.
there's a sense of having lost something that I had, like, and becoming very sort of isolated and kind of dead.
Hmm.
You know how Philip Kapleau in the diaries, the diary entries and the Three Pillars of Zen, before he went to Japan, or one reason he went to Japan, he said, I just want to get rid of this dead feeling I'm feeling all the time. It was kind of
Hmm.
like that.
Hmm.
So I wasn't thinking so much in terms of God, but this kind of sort of animistic sense of connection.
Hmm. It's really interesting. Yeah, it is. It's funny. I don't know if funny is the right word, but interestingly, a lot of the subtext of the Lord of the Rings is there was a paradise that's lost. And like the new age is materialist and non-magical, and like like there's a sense of almost sorrow as like this the magical first and second ages are passing on and the elves are leaving Middle Earth. And like that there so that made me think of that when you're talking about where you've kind of a sense of loss and separation. And
But is it
that,
really a subtext that things were lost? I
I
mean,
think so. you know
certainly the elves were departing for the west, for
mhm.
the island of Erisea, to which only they could go, unless you were allowed to go by special dispensation, as
Like being a
Frodo
rainwater.
and Sam and Bilbo did in the
Yeah.
end. But there was a sense of sort of that I never thought of it in terms that
It's
never thought of it quite in those terms.
like, for example, the one scene where Sam and Frodo, I think it's just or maybe Merry and Pippin are with them, but they're secretly leaving the Shire, and they're sitting there by the side of the road, and they're seeing the elves walk by, and they're heading
Oh
to the
yeah,
west, and
yeah.
they're singing this really sad song. Like Sam's like, oh, it's just so sad. It's just and um, yeah, there's lots of little scenes like that. I think paint
That's in the Fellowship of
to
the
me.
Ring, just after they've left,
Yeah,
and
this is the first of the
they
three
meet
parts.
that elf and his sort of band who are
Right.
wandering.
Mhm.
I forget
Well, they're
his
not
name.
wandering. Well,
Well, they were kind of wandering. They weren't going to they weren't going to take ship to the west. The
oh, I
elves
thought they
kind of
were.
wandered around. I mean,
Okay.
unless the ones that were at home in Rivendell or in Lothlorien, they weren't wandering around. They were home.
Hmm.
But that band was kind of wandering around,
Okay. I guess I'm
not in
remembering.
a desolate way. That's just,
Yeah.
what they were doing. But
Hmm.
yeah, there is that sense. They were singing a song of Valinor, hymn that Valinor. She was one of the what are they called? The gods. She was one of the gods.
Was the
The
Valor, I think.
what?
The Valor.
Yeah, she
Yeah.
was one of those.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was kind of sad in a piercingly beautiful way.
Hmm.
I could really relate to that sense of sort of piercing beauty.
So
beauty,
as a
beauty,
teenager,
beauty that is so beautiful that it hurts.
yeah, I've certainly had that experience with music many times. So speaking of music, did you, as a teenager, you later went in to become a professional musician and later a music scholar? I mean, did you have a connection to music early on?
Oh yeah. I started taking piano lessons when I was in third grade. I don't know what they call third grade now, but I think it was third grade.
Hmm.
Um, I guess I was in 9 years old, or
Hmm.
maybe before that. No, I think it might have. Anyway, with a marvelous couple named Hubert and Tanya Kessler at in Urbana. Hubert was the head of the composition theory department at the University of Illinois. He was from Vienna, and his wife was one of the last students of Theodore Leczetitsky, probably not pronouncing that right, one of the great piano pedagogues of the early 20th century. And they were just so, they were sort of old world, but very warm, and while being very strict as teachers too. And in that tradition of teaching, when you took piano lessons, they didn't just teach you piano. Especially Hubert, he taught you music theory and harmony and counterpoint. All of that came with it. All of that was sort of part of the piano lesson. He wanted to teach me German, and for some stupid reason, I refused. I wish I had not refused, and then I would be able to speak German much better, or and read German now. I think it's because I was studying Latin and Greek, especially Latin in high school. I thought it would interfere in some weird way.
Did he
So
want you to learn because of operas, or why? What's the
if you're a
connection?
music scholar, German is kind of the language, the
Oh, okay.
sine qua non language, because it's such an important language for music scholarship and
Mhm.
for Western music, in general. Um, so I was into music from a very early age. And then around mid high school, my sister got me into quote folk music. Uh, Pete Seeger. Well, she was listening to these quasi folk groups like the Limelighters, but I quickly sort of went through that to the more traditional stuff, the string band music, pre-bluegrass. So I was losing interest in classical music, and I was learning to be a fiddler, playing in the old styles, and I could play some guitar, but I learned to play banjo.
Hmm.
Not bluegrass banjo, but old-timey banjo, two finger clawhammer banjo. My teachers, the Kesslers, were not thrilled with that I
Hmm.
would sort of forsake classical Western music and get so enthusiastic for all this what I call traditional music that they probably thought of as kind of folk music. So
What,
that was happening,
when
and
you say
and then
pre-bluegrass, are you talking about what would colloquially be called Celtic music, like that type of, like Green
no,
Sleeves, like that
I'm
kind of
talking
stuff?
about the sort of music that was played, especially in the Appalachians, before bluegrass came along. Bluegrass is not very old.
Hmm.
Bluegrass is sort of an amalgam of blues and swing and old timey, and kind of Bill Monroe, and mainly
Hmm.
put it together around 1939 or so. Old timey music is the music that its roots were with the English, Irish, and Scottish settlers into the Appalachian, mixed with a lot of black music,
Hmm.
which gives it sort of bluesy. So that's a much older music, and that's the sort that I was into. And it's called old timey music, or old timey string band music.
What was the
The
appeal? Was it purely just it sounded great, or did it kind of awaken kind of a sense of, you were talking about how a sense of loss you had? Was it kind of, since it was kind of older and kind of authentic, did it kind of kind of reconnect you to that feeling you had a little bit, or
Oh, it just sounded great.
you just purely aesthetically?
Purely aesthetically, and I wanted to
Mhm.
play it, so I taught myself old-timey banjo.
Mhm.
And later on, after I dropped out of college, I made my living as a fiddler and banjo player in three or four different bands in various places. Rochester, New York, because I was there because Rochester, New York was not just the home of the Rochester Zen Center, it was the home of a thriving old-time music scene.
Hmm.
And in fact, there were a number of people who were into both. John Herman would be the comes to mind immediately. And I think that if you get this new book of Tongan Roshi's talks that just came out,
Mhm.
there's actually a picture of I think that there's a picture of John in one of the group pictures towards the end.
Mhm.
It sure looks like him, and I know he did study with with Tonga. So I was in Rochester, and then I played in a band in Cleveland, and then I decided I wasn't going to be able to make a living like that. So I went back to school. Went back to school, got my undergraduate degree, got my PhD in New York. So
New York City.
New York, yeah.
Mhm. And what? So, trying to think. You're a little too young to have been in the hippie scene, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm too I'm no, I'm
No,
too young to be in the beat scene.
right.
The Beats were the ones that were into wearing black and
Hmm.
listening to jazz and into Zen, you know.
Hmm.
Um, no, I was pretty much contemporaneous with the hippie scene, but I
Were you
wasn't.
part of it?
No, not
Right.
really.
Mhm.
Um, I liked some of the music,
Mhm.
like the band, for instance. Um,
Have you ever heard of the Grateful Dead?
of course, but I never saw one of their concerts. I would just listen to some of their albums.
Hmm.
Um, no, all that was going on while I was in high school and college.
Hmm. Did you have any forays into psychedelics or anything like that?
Not then. Later on, after I left home and I was being a professional musician in various places, I did do some psychedelics, but I didn't like the effect.
Hmm.
I mean, so I didn't go that far. I just stopped.
Hmm.
I just couldn't see the point.
Hmm. What was your introduction to kind of Eastern thought or Eastern religion? Did you read in college or high school or anything like that, or take any martial arts, do yoga?
Um, Early on, when I was in high school, and after the sort of big psychological crash occurred, from reading Tolkien, I branched out to the Inklings,
Hmm.
C.S. Charles Williams and C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis got me interested in Christianity. And and I was reading Thomas Merton too. And I actually went so far as to get baptized as a Catholic. My family were kind of upset at that. But C.S. Lewis just sounded so convincing. You know, he was such a good uh, arguer. Um, although he met his match later on. But um, and then I went so far as to I was interested in becoming a monk. I must have felt that would sort of help me get back into grace, you know, become alive again. And I even wrote to the Carthusians. The Carthusians were an aromatic order. Um,
Are they the ones who make the chartreuse liqueur?
yes, the Grand Chartreuse, they make it. The Carthusians, Chartreuse, and their head place was still is in France, the Grand Chartreuse, but they had opened up a place in Vermont. Um, very similar to the Carthusians are the Camaldulies. There's a Camaldulies, the new Camaldulies monastery in somewhere in Big Sur. James Ford has blogged about it. Anyway, so I actually went so far as to write them. And then they wrote me back saying, well, we're interested. You must complete your college education, and you must pay your reverence to Mary, the Mother of God, every day. Well, I wasn't interested in Mary, not in the slightest degree, or in saying the rosary. I mean, and I sort of my interest went down really quickly.
Mhm.
And then my sister, who always gets into things before I do, said she got into Zen, and she told me about Zen and Keplow's book, The Three Pillars of Zen. And as soon as I read that, all my thoughts of becoming a monk just transferred into Zen.
Mhm.
And I ended up in going to Rochester and becoming a member of the Rochester Zen Center. Philip Kaplow was in his heyday then.
Mhm.
Hugh Curran was there, by the way.
Was this early 70s?
Yes.
Mhm.
And that also was one of the reasons I got so much into old time music, because as I said, there was a huge trying to revival this old time music scene as well as a big Zen scene.
Mhm.
And not that the same people were necessarily all into both, that there was an overlap.
Mhm.
So that's how I forget what it was you asked,
I forget too.
but,
Um,
that's how if you asked how I got into Zen,
oh, I
that's
had asked
what.
what were your introductions to Eastern thought in general?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And actually before I went to Rochester, I had actually gotten interested in Zen while you see, I went to college the first time at the University of Illinois. I dropped out before taking a degree. And I was reading about Zen then. There wasn't that much available. I was reading D.T. Suzuki's Zen and the Arts,
Mhm.
and other Suzuki-ish things. And there was an Aikido group, but I checked them out, but I never participated. Um, I thought the Aikido teacher would be a Zen adept. He wasn't. He was an Aikido teacher.
Mhm.
So I'd already started reading, not Watts. I never liked Watts, but Suzuki I liked.
Mhm.
Um, Suzuki seemed to be on better scholarly ground. Like he could read he knew the languages, he knew the sources. He was a
Mhm.
respectable scholar, whereas Watts was not.
Mhm. Do you
So
ever read Christmas
had
Humphreys?
hmm?
Christmas Humphreys. He was kind of big back then too. Did you ever read his stuff?
I read some of his stuff, yeah. Though I cannot really remember what it was. I don't think he wrote that much. So I was into it to a certain degree before uh, I ran across the three pillars of Zen and ended up going to Rochester.
So when you were in your phase where you got baptized and were thinking of becoming a monk, so did you believe explicitly in God and feel Jesus was God's son? I mean, was
I
that
don't
something?
think I ever got that far. I
Yeah.
think I had this sort of romantic idea of being a monk and the solitude and the silence, and I think it was kind of a romantic thing. I don't think I really knew much of the stuff that every Catholic knows. Um, it
How about
was,
the how about Mass? Did that resonate with you? Like the because
yeah, it did. I remember I would go to Mass, and that did resonate with me. I liked the ritual.
Mhm.
I like the participatory sense of the ritual.
Mhm. And so, did you meditate at all prior to visiting the Rochester Zen Center?
I must have. Oh, yes. This has something to do with being a musician. Somehow I felt I evolved my own technique other people, I wasn't the only one, I found a sense where I would focus on sound. I wouldn't count my breaths or follow my breaths or do those classic things. I would focus my mind on sound, whatever sound was going around. The sounds of the cars on the highway, the sound of the refrigerator hum, anything that was kind of constant could sort of serve as an object of attention. And then it's just like any other meditation object, your mind wanders, you bring it back, your mind wanders, you bring it back. And so that's what I did. When I finally got to Rochester, and Philip Capello was not thrilled with that at all, and immediately put me on counting the breaths. I didn't really want to do it, but I'd gone to study with him, so I did.
Did you playing music itself, famously for some people, playing music kind of puts people in a flow state. Was that part of your experience of it at all?
I would do Zazen while playing music. I mean, I would, instead of focusing on the sound of cars on the road, I'd focus on the sound of the music I was making. I was providing my own meditation object. So especially banjo. So for me, music was meditated in a very purposeful sense, and it became very intense.
Would you get a sense of kind of losing yourself and merging with the music, so to speak?
I don't think I did that much more. I think I did more kind of bread and butter, bringing the attention back than merging. Although there was a moment where I did merge. Should I say more about that?
Yes, please.
Well, I was in Rochester. I was sharing a house with some other people on Park Avenue, which is just a few blocks from Arnold Park, where the center is. And I was doing Zazen by myself up on the second floor of a friend's house, and I was, fiercely concentrating on the sound of traffic. And it was very much, here's me trying to concentrate on that sound, And then it's a sort of like zoom. I penetrated, and instead of me focusing on the sound, it's like I become huge, sort of no boundaries. And the sound was inside me. And I didn't have to work on concentrating it. It was just like effortlessly flowing in this sort of no boundary space. The sense of me as a body focusing on that thing over there had just disappeared. It was like, but then I don't know how long I was in there, not very long. But then it's like, boom, I was out. I know, back out in the feeling kind of relaxed. But so that was interesting. That was the one time that I sort of pierced through something.
This is after you'd started Zen practice?
It was before I was in Rochester, but I was a trial member.
Okay.
So I was going to the center to sit, but I was still doing my own practice of concentrating on sound. Those days you couldn't have Doksan with the Roshi as a trial member. So I couldn't go and tell Philip Capello what the hell was that, And by the time I did become a full member and I could go to Doksan, I did bring it up once. But it had, it was just a memory at that point. And Capello was very fierce. Capello Roshi was very fierce. I said I'd had this experience, and he could, and he says, "What experience?" And he could be very fierce, and so I sort of tried to stammer it out, but I was so sort of cowed by his kind of tiger pouncing posture, way of dealing with it, that I just sort of dropped it. And then he said, "Well, from now on, I want you to count your breaths."
Hmm.
So I don't feel I ever really properly told him about that, because his reaction sort of cowed me.
How
Much
about
later,
later
much
teachers like Pat Hawk or
Hmm?
other teachers you worked with?
What about that?
Do you ever bring it up to Pat Hawk or any of your other later teachers?
Yes, I did. Much later, I
Hmm.
brought it up to Pat Hawk. Pat Hawk was not fierce. Well, he was fierce occasionally, but he wasn't fierce habitually. Uh, and Pat, it was very interesting, Pat's reaction. He sort of said, he looked at me for a while. He said, you know, I shouldn't criticize. And then stopped because he didn't want to criticize. I said, no, go ahead, criticize. And he said, well, you know, a teacher should have been able to build on that.
Hmm.
And I thought, that was interesting.
Hmm.
And that gives me a better perspective on it too.
Hmm. So when you first went to Rochester, what was your initial impression of the center, impression of the teacher, of the students? Did you resonate right away? Did it feel like home? Were you like, this is what I've been looking for? Or
Didn't feel
did
like home.
it did not?
It was a kind of fierce place. The Rochester Zen Center prided itself on being the quote boot camp of American Zen, unquote.
Hmm.
They felt they were tougher. They were kind of the Marine Corps of American Zen.
Hmm.
Um, um, and so that's one aspect of it. So they were all very gung ho, and they used the Kiyosaku pretty fiercely. And I think it was Sunyana Grafe, Vermont Zen Center, who pointed out that when Philip Kapleau came back to America and founded his own place, he did not model it after Yasutani Roshi's style of teaching. He modeled and it was under Yasutani Roshi that he'd gone through Mu and proceeded to subsequent koans. He modeled it under Hoshinji, Harada Roshi's very, very strict monastery,
Hmm.
even though that's not necessarily the style that really suited him the best. But so it was kind of that atmosphere. So that was one impression. Another is that there was a thriving staff program. They weren't monks, although Rochester did have its own experiment with ordaining people. Didn't last. Um, there were people on staff, and there were people who were not on staff, and there was a definite feeling of sort of the in group and the out group.
Hmm.
I mean, if you weren't on staff, you went to the center to their to sit, and then you'd go to sesshin, but you weren't part of the in group. So, and then the third thing is there was this sort of uneasy feeling in the background connected with Philip Kapleau's or Kapleau Roshi's um, the fact that he did not complete his training under Yasutani, and he was not a Dharma heir. He
So
was
that
a
was well known
Inca.
contemporarily at the time.
It wasn't talked about because Kapleau was very sensitive about people talking about it. So, but it was known. It just was sort of known as not quite not quite openly, but it was known.
Hmm.
And so there was a sense of discomfort about it. Um, because Yasutani Roshi was still alive, and he didn't die till 6 years after the center was founded. And I recall thinking at the time, why doesn't Kapleau Roshi go back to Japan? Because he would go on trips with his students to Buddhist countries,
Hmm.
including to Japan. Why doesn't he go back and try to mend fences with Yasutani before it's too late? Because Yasutani was quite old at that time. I'm not
Hmm.
sure how old he was when he died, but he was pretty old. And I thought, well, he's just too stubborn or something. Um, Later on, someone told me, and I don't know if it's true or not, that Kapla Roshi had approached Yasutani Roshi while in Japan on one of those trips, and Yasutani refused to see him.
Hmm.
And instead of doing what you do at a Zen monastery, which is, you sit out on the steps till they let you in. And that was that. But I don't even know if that story is true or not. And I can't even remember who told it to me, but it may well be true.
How far did Yasutani get through the? I'm sorry, Capello get through the curriculum? Do you know?
Yes, he was on Mu for a long time. He went through the Mubunkan. He went through all of the Hekagon Roku, the Blue Cliff record, and then he did most or all of the precept koans, which are usually done at the end of the curriculum.
Hmm.
He did not do, and that's what and of course he did the miscellaneous koans too,
Hmm.
before the Mumonkan. And I think that's as far as he went before the big breakup with his teacher Yasutani.
So he didn't do the Book of Serenity. He didn't do the five ranks.
That's right.
Hmm.
Or the Denko Roku,
Hmm.
the
That way,
transmission
yeah.
of light. Um, it No, he didn't. And he never claimed to be a Dharma heir of
Hmm.
Yasutani,
Hmm.
but he did claim that Yasutani had given him, well, first he was ordained under Yasutani Roshi, and he said that Yasutani Roshi had given him permission to teach as a missionary of the Sambo Kyodan.
Hmm.
And he had various he had you know, the sense he had various documents, certifications, but since Bowden Roshi could not read Japanese, and I mean, so anyway, there was this big flare up later on after the breakup between Koan Yamada Roshi and Kapla Roshi, and the kind of somewhat marginal a member of the center called David Skates that led to a series of letters. And Aitken wrote one of those letters, and they're very revealing about the sort of Koen Yamada and Philip Kepler were not getting along. This was long after Yasutani had died, and they circulated for a while, but I'm not sure I'm getting into this, but they're very revealing. But
Hmm.
anyway, you asked how far he got in the curriculum. That's how far.
Hmm.
Sorry, I keep kind of wandering off on the stream of consciousness stuff.
Oh, that's okay. That's my style very much. So it works good. So what was your impression with him as a teacher? So you're a relatively novice Zen student. Were you intimidated by him? Was
Yes,
Yeah,
very much so. He
yeah.
was very fierce.
Mhm. Did he give you moo? Did you do moo with him?
Yeah, he did.
Hmm.
Um, and later on, I'd walk around. I not focusing on Mu. I was going through the whole thing. A monk says to Joshu, "Does the dog have Buddha nature or not?" I shouldn't have been going through the whole thing. I should have been focusing on the Wado.
Hmm.
But anyway, after doing a few sesshin, I decided I wanted to do Hu. Hu was an alternate practice done at Rochester.
Hmm.
Who am I?
Hmm.
Um, they got it from Sri Ramana Maharshi,
Hmm.
and so they switched me to Who, and that's what I worked on for a long time. Yeah, and Robert Aitken changes that. He's if he the formulation there is who is hearing that sound, which
Hmm.
is a bit different.
Hmm.
But so that's as far as I got while I was at Rochester.
Hmm. So you would bring in presentations to him, and would he just ring you out with fierceness, or would there be discussions, or what was the Dokusan experience like?
Uh, I think Doxon were very short because I kind of didn't have a clue, and um, I didn't kind of get anywhere.
Hmm.
And he was pretty fierce.
Hmm.
But then later on, I worked, I did sashimi under Tony Packer,
Hmm. Is this
and
when
that
she
was,
was still involved with Rochester, or is this after she
oh
broke
yeah,
up?
she was a star student, and it's
But
just
when you worked
marvelous
with her, was it prior to her splitting off or after she split off?
prior to her splitting off.
Okay.
Um, and then after, but I did the contrast between Tony Packer's way of running the center and Tony Packer's style in Doxon was so different from Kaplo's. And then I worked with Kaplo's heir, Bowden Colheed, Roshi, for a while. And then that was around that time Tony Packer left the center. Her way of working with people was, a lot of people didn't like it, and that's what, and she came to the conclusion, as you know, that she could not say she was a Buddhist.
Hmm.
Well, Kapleau was very much of a Buddhist. He really felt being a Buddhist was important, and so all that happened. But I never worked with Tony Packer after she left the center, only while she was there.
But you would work on Moo with, or Who, or Moo with her.
I would work on who. In
Mhm.
fact, I had some letters she wrote me. We correspond because I had moved out of Rochester, and um I was attending graduate school in New York.
Mhm. Did you keep up your practice with pretty good diligence when you moved to New York and were in graduate school?
Well, as diligently as I could make myself, And I would, as I mentioned, I'd go around to some of the other zendos in town. There was the Village Zendo with Pat O'Hara. She was at that time a student of Daido Luri. Daido had his own kind of place in New York. That was before Pat O'Hara went back to Miyazumi and became his student.
Hmm.
Um, there were some other there were some others Zen or Korean Zen places in New York. So I would kind of go there, and then I would go back to Rochester for sashimi, even
Hmm.
from all even though I was living in the city. From Rochester to New York is not that long a train ride.
Hmm. Did you ever run across Shimano?
Who?
Shimano, the Renzai teacher?
Oh, him. Not much. I got I got a friend of mine named Ragnar Ness, was a potter, still is a potter in Brooklyn, because he was the brother of Bob Ness, who was in a band I played with called the Swamp Root String Band, and I was living in Rochester.
Hmm.
We were part of that whole folk revival, traditional music revival. So I got Ragnar interested in Zen, and we went together to Edo Shimano's place in the city on the east side. And I didn't go there because I felt I was working with people in Rochester. I didn't want to just switch to someone else just because he happened to live in New York. So that was my one experience with Edo. I never went to Daibozatsu. I thought it was pretty. Edo was he was full of Bushido. He's very kind of samurai kind of personality and
Hmm.
very sort of dramatic in his Zen style. Um, I didn't quite feel comfortable with it, but Ragnar, my friend, did study with Edo for some time, and until one of their periodic scandals where all the students left and then a new bunch came in, and
Mhm.
he was one of the people who left. He was with Edo a few years. I was not.
Did he go somewhere else? Do you know?
No, he didn't. Edo passed him on Mu. It made a big difference to him, but he did not study with anyone else, as far as I know. Edo had a way, I think, of kind of burning people out on Zen.
Mm-hmm. And that's really kind of a lot of the shame of the scandals is how it would kind of poison people's appreciation of Zen and they drop out of practice.
Yeah, kind of like,
Aside from the victims, of course. I mean, I feel
I
kind of
mean,
bad.
Edo was impressive,
Mm-hmm.
but once people kind of caught on to some of the stuff he was doing, it wasn't just sex, it was power and authority too.
Mm-hmm.
And they figure, well, if this is the sort of person Zen produces, I want nothing to do with it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Um, so you're at this point, you're a couple years in your practice. Um, were you seeing any changes in your life? What was bringing you back to the practice?
Well, I'd gotten pretty dependent on Zazen. I was a Zazen junkie.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that I'd attended tons and tons of sesshin. I wasn't a sesshin junkie, but I was a Zazen junkie. So I would go into withdrawal if I stopped sitting. That's still true,
Mm-hmm.
you know, because there's times I get really busy, so I don't sit for 5 or 6 days, and I can feel it right away. Well, I can feel it soon. So
Mm-hmm.
I think what kept me going was the addiction to the Zazen narcotic.
Mm-hmm. Well,
And but
you're
also,
joking. You're joking, but I've read one study that they had this monk who could go into the first jhana pretty easily and and on command almost. They hooked him up to the fMRI and everything, and they're seeing what was happening with his brain when he'd go into the first jhana, and that's the joy and so forth type of Buddhist trance. And it was the opioid parts of the brain is lighting up. So I mean, it's in the the little bit that I've had of that type of practice. I mean, it feels warm and comforting, and it's literally like a heroin high in some ways.
it didn't make me feel warm or comforting. What it did is I things got quiet.
Hmm.
I could suddenly hear all the little sounds I wasn't picking up on,
Hmm.
which there's this sense of transparency.
Hmm.
Um, I wasn't that interested in being warm and fuzzy, but I really liked feeling clear and transparent and kind of focused.
Hmm.
That's and plus I also thought, well, maybe I'll get enlightened, maybe I have some sort of insight, that might happen too. Uh,
Hmm.
Icing on the cake.
Hmm.
But really it was the Zazen experience that no, of course you have horrible sits, but that's part for the course. But
Hmm.
that's what kept me going, I think.
Hmm. Um, so you finish your degree. What was kind of your next, or you finish your doctorate? What were kind of your next steps in terms of life and Zen path and so forth?
Well, I was in New York. Um, parted ways with Bowden.
Hmm.
Um, I had known Bowden as a senior student. I mean, not well, but he was around the place while I was in Rochester. And then Kaplo made him his Dharma heir.
Hmm.
And but eventually I found that Bowden, I didn't feel that didn't feel we were communicating very well. I felt that I would say something that would go right past Bowden, and I felt that Bowden wasn't actually hearing anything I was saying. And that began to bother me. I mean, that might have been just my delusion, but I didn't feel we were communicating.
Hmm.
Um, and I went to this one session where I just sort of had this kind of sort of mini breakdown, and I left the session before the end. Only time I've done that, and
Hmm.
went back to New York City. So after that, I decided I was going to look for someone else. Well, Nelson Foster was giving some sessions in New Haven.
Oh, really? Where
And
was he already out in the Ring of Bone at this point?
yeah, he was in the Ring of Bone, but he was also coming east to do work with this New Haven Zendo called, and I forget what they were called. He would do like a few short session a year, 3 days maybe,
Hmm.
and they weren't that far away, another short train ride. Um, and I'd been reading Aitken, and I really liked Aitken's writings, and I really liked the sense that he was real. I mean, he was obviously really doing Zen, but he was also kind of low key.
Hmm.
Aitken was not a samurai, did not have a samurai Bushido personality.
Hmm.
Um, and also he was very precise with words, and words are important to me, and I like precision.
Hmm.
Um, and Nelson Foster was a Dharma heir of Aitken. So I started doing some short sesshin with Nelson. Rafe Martin came to one of them. And by
Hmm.
the way, I had known Rafe because I had met Rafe in Rochester years ago, and I had actually worked for him at the Oxcart Bookshop.
Oh, interesting.
So Rafe and I go back all a long way. And and but Nelson didn't come out to the East Coast that often. And at that point, someone told me about Pat Hawk, and Pat Hawk was also a Dharma heir, one of Aitken Roshi's first Dharma heirs. Let's see, there was Nelson Foster, Pat Hawk.
Well, and Tarrant was his first, right? John Tarrant.
They were kind of at the same time or very
Okay.
close because I think he had, who was first or who was second is sort of they were clustered together so close, I think. Um, anyway, everything I heard about since Nelson was not that accessible, unless I went out to California a lot, which I didn't feel I could do. Um, everything I heard about Pat Hawk, I resonated with.
The
That he
flashy personality, over the top.
Pat Hawk was silent, hardly said anything.
Hmm.
Oh, he could give Taisho and he spoke in Dachshund, but he was not a sociable person.
Hmm.
He was silent. He tended to be grumpy, sort of a curmudgeon. He had, in a sense, no charisma. You see, uh, you know, here's a box. This box is not particularly charismatic. It's a
Hmm.
good box, but uh, and I really liked all of that. I like understatement. I tend to be suspicious of people with a lot of pizzazz. Uh, so I ended up doing a session with Pat Hawk. He was out in Tucson at that time. He was a Redemptorist priest, a Catholic Redemptorist priest, and we really got along well. And one of Pat Hawk's sidelines was taking in Rochester burnouts. I wasn't the first by any means. And I just felt really, really at home with him. And from that point on, I became his student. I'd go out there for session once or twice a year. We would do docuphone, we called it, or that turned into docu iChat or docu Skype.
Hmm.
And I worked with Pat until he died. Um,
How many years was that?
I think it was about a decade.
Hmm.
he was already, I think, had contracted the what kind of cancer? Prostate cancer. But he carried on for a good while.
Mhm.
He basically carried on till the very end, except for a month or so. Um, so at that point, I was firmly Diamond Sangha, because the Diamond Sangha just seemed to be. I didn't really relate to the samurai style, um, and also within that firmly Pat Hawk.
Um, so he was low key, but when you went to Dokusan with him, would it be a conversation, or was it just like koan presentation, pass fail, you're out of there, or was there give and take? Would he talk to you?
Pat Pat would talk to me in Doksan, and I was and after I realized I should be taking notes, I
Mhm.
asked him early. He didn't ask me to take notes, but I asked him early on, and from then I would took very scrupulous notes. I
Mhm.
mean, really scrupulous notes. Um, so he would talk to me in Doksan, but he was very much to the point. Say, well, what do you think of this? What's the point of this? What do you think this is about? Why did Joshua do such
Mhm.
and such? Um, he didn't wander around. Uh, he did wander around as he got older and more ill. Um, are you asking about his Dachshund style?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just, since he was not a very showy, loquacious type of person, I'm just wondering, was he willing? And you answered the question. Was he willing to go into things on Dokusan, or was he
Yes,
just
he
real like
was.
terse and quick?
It wasn't one of these things where you ring the bell, you go, you sit down in front of the teacher, and then he rings the bell immediately. It wasn't like that's what Koryu Osaku did. I guess a number. No, he would talk to you, or I mean, you could talk with him. Um, but he wasn't. You didn't feel he short shifted you, but when he was done talking to you, then you couldn't linger.
Mhm.
Um, um, one interesting thing is that initially he had these big books of three-ring binders stuffed with notes on the koans. Uh, I think a lot of it was his own material,
Mhm.
but then those disappeared for some reason, and I never saw them again. And I noticed after that that Pat would focus on one or two main points on the koan, or in the case of the mumakan, on the verse, but he wouldn't go through like a list of 4 or 5 points
The
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 way
checking
that say
questions.
James Ford was, because he wasn't referring to his notes.
Mhm.
Um, he was just doing it. So he would like focus on it and what he thought was the main thing. But later, when I started working with James Ford, or even with Pat's student Susan Weimer, I realized there were koan points he was leaving out.
Mhm.
Whereas, they were using notes. Susan Weimer had notes, and then James Ford, who doesn't have a good memory, always refers to his notes. So they don't leave things out. So I noticed, and that got more and more marked as he got more and more ill.
Mhm. And you switched back from who to moo with him, right?
No, I passed who,
Oh, okay.
and then he started me in, and
You
then he
passed
made
who
me
with
Pat Hawk,
okay.
and then he started me with Moo, and I was on that for a while.
Mhm.
And then we went, to one hand and the source of Moo, and then to the miscellaneous koans proper.
Mhm.
So we really began to sort of move around, move along, so to speak, in the curriculum under Pat.
Hmm.
So I kind of consider Pat to be my root teacher.
Hmm. When you worked with Pat Starmeyer and James Ford, did you start a? You finished the koan curriculum, isn't that right?
No, James Ford is not Pat Starmeyer. He's
No,
John Terrence Starmeyer.
right. I kind of mumbled my. I kind of said three things at once, and none of them sounded
Oh,
right. So let me start over. You finished the koan curriculum with Pat Hawk, is that correct?
not quite, because he died too soon.
Okay.
I was in, I was sort of more than halfway through the Denko Roku
Hmm.
when Pat died. Um, but then I continued with one of his heirs, Susan Weimer, and also another one of his heirs, Leonard Marcel,
Hmm.
out in Oregon. Um, Actually, that was just one session. And I at that point, since Pat had died, I was kind of I was checking various teachers out.
Hmm.
But I guess I finished the formal Diamond Sangha curriculum under Susan Weimer Roshi.
Hmm. And then was James your next teacher after that?
Well, I went through a period of kind of checking people out. Um, um, Ruben Hobito,
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
but by that time I'd gotten an academic job in Denton, Texas, which is between Fort Worth and Dallas.
Hmm.
Ruben Hobito is in Dallas. Um, so so he is fairly close to me. So I worked with him a little bit, but somehow I missed the sense of rapport I had with Pat.
Hmm.
I mean, Ruben Hobito is marvelous, but I didn't sense the rapport I'd gotten used to. And rapport isn't everything, but rapport is important too.
I think
Um,
heart connection with a teacher is important, to some degree.
so um, I think so uh a guy named Weasel Tracks, Victor Zupinski, I think that's not quite his name, who had started working with James Ford. Actually, he didn't continue for that long, I think. He became part of Sheng Yan's group in it. Yeah, I'd also worked with Sheng Yan because the Chinese teacher,
Hmm.
um, the Chinese Chan teacher, because he had a place in Elmhurst, which is kind of a suburb of New York City. So I went out there. I met Gyogu, if that's how it's pronounced. I
Yeah.
didn't meet Mado Moore. Maybe we went out at different times, um, but that didn't feel quite right either. So anyway, um, I ended up kind of making approaches to James Ford, and James was interested, and James had actually done a session with Pat Hawk.
Mhm.
Um, and he felt he'd gotten something out of that session. I mean, he respected Pat. So I ended up working with James, um, mainly remotely. Although there was a time when James and his wife Jan came out to the Metroplex, which is Denton, Dallas, Fort Worth, to go to Unitarian conference. So we met each other there. But my work with James has mainly been remote,
Mhm.
but very steady.
Mhm.
And since I'd worked in person, supposedly if you've worked with a lot of people in person, the it's easier to work remotely. Um, and I'm still working with the James now. And you asked if I'd finished the curriculum with Pat, and I said with his Dharma heir Sue Weimer.
Mhm.
Well, in the end, I decided with James, we kind of played around with entangling the vines,
Mm-hmm.
but in the end, I felt rather uncertain about some of really a number of the koans I had done with Pat. So we decided, or really I decided, with James' agreement, to simply start all over again from scratch. And we've
From
been doing that ever since.
from Moo.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it was and just redid all of the miscellaneous koans, which are different. Every teacher who uses the koans have their own version of the miscellaneous koans. There's a lot of overlap, but there's a lot of differences. And we've been doing that ever since. In fact, we're still doing it.
Mm-hmm. And James is, I've never met him in person, but I've interacted with him over the internet, and I interviewed him, of course. I mean, he seems like an incredibly warm, easy to work with person. Is that?
James is James is quite a change after Pat.
Mm-hmm.
James is very warm. He's very generous. He's extremely busy. I think that James has a way of filling up his time with every conceivable. He fills up his calendar so that he's always to the max. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think he can help it. Uh, um, James sort of has made a one of the things he's known for is taking people who are sort of orphaned, like
Mm-hmm.
their teachers have died,
Mm-hmm.
um, and kind of taking them in, or something happened with their teachers or and kind of taking them in. He's done
Mm-hmm.
that a number of times with a number of people. I wasn't quite in that category, but I felt kind of orphaned because Pat was no longer around. So I started. James is James is very warm. He's very generous. But the conspicuous difference between James and Pat Hawk is that Pat Hawk is like one of the most silent person I have ever met. Pat Hawk was like, I mean, he was talkative in Teisho and Doksan, but like if after the session, you wouldn't see Pat leave. You would just see that he wasn't there any longer. He would like he kind of vaporized when no one was looking.
Mm-hmm.
Um, whereas Pat is silent person. Now, just by nature, it's not because the Redemptorists are a silent Catholic order. James has the gift of gab.
Mm-hmm.
James is talkative. Um, and in that regard, he's sort of the complete opposite to Pat.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of my Dachshund with you mentioned, you know, were Dachshund with Pat, were they really short? No, but Dachshund, at least a Dachshund on the phone with James can go quite long
Mm-hmm.
because James is a talkative person.
Mm-hmm.
So that was very interesting. The very almost diametrically different personalities.
Mm-hmm. So James is kind of in a sub lineage of Diamond Sangha. So is the curriculum and the view into the koans largely the same, you found, or has there been some divergence in that kind of sub lineage?
I don't think there's any inconsistency, but James is a lot more systematic than Pat was when I was working with him.
Mm-hmm.
Because as I said, Pat kind of threw away his books of notes. You know, we James and I have talked about this, whether people should take notes on their doxon if they're working on koans or not.
Mm-hmm.
The if and he pretty much comes down to, yeah, you should, because you will forget. You
Mm-hmm.
will forget, and maybe you say, oh, well, it's a good thing you forget, then you can be spontaneous every time. But there's a certain amount of maybe reinventing the wheel. And James has told me many times his memory has never been that good. He says that his work with Tarrant was mainly just trying to memorize the koans.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's how he'd work on them, by trying to memorize them. So with James works, and this is something that James' successor in Toledo, you interviewed him. What's his name?
Um, Wick,
White.
Wyke, yeah.
This is something he pointed out in your interview with him. So James has he has notes, he has certain number of koan points he's going to ask about.
Mhm.
Pat had gotten quite loose in this regard. So I don't think there's any inconsistency, but James is much more systematic.
And do you guys work on the verses as well, and or any of the?
With the Mumonkan, yes, but with the Blue Cliff record, with the Blue Cliff record, Book of Serenity, no. The Denko Roku, yes.
Interesting.
Why? You don't, or you
Oh, we
do?
do. I've had to do it all the way through. Yeah. So,
You worked on the verses for the Blue Cliff record, and
mhm.
oh,
But which I mean, I find the verses much harder than the koans, and I think it's partially because I have kind of an engineering brain, and and so it's really it's hard for me to get into poetry mode, and so it's good for me. I'm glad I do it, but it's
you're not in the Diamond Sangha
no,
tradition. You're not
it's the
in,
white plum, right?
well, yeah. So in the Diamond Sangha, which stems from, it's a Harada Yasutani, and they stem from what has become the Sambo Kyodan, then Sambo Zen.
Hmm.
People do not work on the verses to the Blue Cliff record and the Book of Serenity. I don't know why, but they don't.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Yep, I'm forced to do it. Yeah, but again, I'm glad I do because it doesn't come easy for me. So it's a challenge that brings growth. And plus, I think a lot of times, uh, I don't know if actually I'm not going to talk about this. It would give too much away. Never mind.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I've sometimes wondered why not, but I've never actually asked. I have
Yeah.
a feeling if I asked James, he probably would say he doesn't know either.
Hmm.
Well, maybe next time, maybe I will ask him, see what he says.
Yeah.
It just
Interesting.
seems not to be the way they do it.
Mhm. So, is there anything you want to talk about koans or your practice before we switch over to the chanting stuff?
Um, no, I think I've been pretty voluble, maybe too voluble
Hmm.
about all this stuff, bouncing from one thing to another. So I can't think of anything else.
Okay.
Except I will say that it's interesting to me how much it just comes down to sitting regularly, whatever cons I've passed or whatever. If I don't sit, it's like if you're it's like not practicing your instrument. You lose your technique, you lose your facility very quickly.
Yeah. The way I conceive of this is, there's different aspects of Buddhism. One of them being samadhi, which I think is generated by zazen, and the other is wisdom. From my own experience, like the wisdom, whatever minor wisdom I may have encountered in Zen, that doesn't go away. That's there front and center every waking moment. But the samadhi, the actually being able to manifest this is very much a use it or lose it thing for me. And for me, if I don't sit for a week, I find it starting to dissipate. And if I go to a session, I get a massive dose of it, and that can last a month or two. But like the samadhi power, just feeling like that is absolutely use it or lose it for me.
I'd say for me, whatever insights, quote unquote, I might have, if they become more intellectual, more abstract, if I'm not, mm, yeah.
Cool. Okay, so now I'd like to transition to talking about the chanting. You talked a
Oh
little bit
yeah,
about your interest in the chanting. It was because you'd met this guy at the Zendo, and he says not music, and that kind of set the ball rolling for you. Yeah, when you said that, real quick, it made me think of how when people go to Tassajara, San Francisco Zen Center's mountain monastery,
yeah.
some of the formal practice periods, they actually ban music during the practice periods, and so all they
They,
get are the bells and the chants, and
yeah, they sound like the Taliban.
and and also I've looked at the Buddha's um, Vinaya. Is that how you pronounce it? The
The
rules.
Vinyas, I think
Vinaya.
the accent's on the first syllable.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've actually said that word before, strangely enough. But um, there's no dancing, no music. That's what those are two of the rules. You know, so
Yeah, well, in at Zen monasteries and at sesshin, you can't just crank up the loudspeaker either,
yeah.
But
Yeah, I mean, for me, I've said this a couple times on this podcast, but if it wasn't for the Grateful Dead, which was very much of a music and dancing experience, 100% certainty I would never have gotten into Buddhism or Zen or
yeah,
anything.
I think the Grateful Dead is sort of like to you is sort of like the Lord of the Rings for me.
Yeah, yeah. I had one teacher kind of say, like, Barry, your real religion is the Grateful Dead. Let's face facts here. But yeah, I mean, it opened up vistas to me that I didn't know existed, and so maybe the Buddha got this one wrong, or he couldn't foresee the Grateful Dead coming. So.
Well, early Buddhism, not that I know much about it, there's a more, I don't know, aesthetic, puritanical, I don't know what
Mhm.
you do get that kind of thing more. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And if you're like I said, I don't know if music is banned in the mosque in the monastery other than chanting, but
Mhm.
uh I know that but Walter Nowick kept on playing the piano as a Zen student in Kyoto, but I don't think he was in a monastery. I don't think, even though he did practice with Goto Roshi and Daitokuji. Um,
Mhm.
well, no, Goto had retired and he was in the anyway. So it's not that Zen has some of that too, but I don't think it's on principle.
Mhm. Yeah. And
Whereas
plus
Robert,
the rules during a practice period could be differing from, other times. Practice periods are, basically, you know, 2/5 of the year for a regular monastic schedule.
yeah,
And
whereas Robert Savage, who was a composer, studying under another very famous composer at Columbia, was very, very fierce, saying Zen chanting is not music.
Mhm.
And there may have been more. I never saw him again, so or I never asked him exactly what he meant because he was so fierce about it. Um, also, but it did
Yeah.
seem very severe.
I'm thinking of traditional monastic places I've done sesshin at, and it's 4 o'clock in the morning. You're in the zendo, and they're bringing that huge densho bell. I was like, and then the drums, and like at the traditional soda places. I mean, it can be incredibly moving and profound and powerful. I mean, it really sets a mood for practice. That you know,
Yeah, besides, Zen practice is full of sounds, full of different bells, different drums, different chants. I mean, it's full of sounds. That's an important part of practice.
mhm,
As Robert Aiken says, you don't do zazen in the sensory deprivation chamber.
mhm. So a good portion of our listeners here have have never been to a traditional Zen center. So can you paint like a picture of like what is chanting in Zen? What role does it play? What's the experience like for them? You
Uh,
know,
uh,
and for a lot of people who have only read about Zen, the services and the chanting and the bowing often kind of come as a shock for people. You know, they.
Well, it did to Philip Kapleau. He was shocked.
Mhm.
Um, when he and his friend, I forget his name, went to Soen Roshi's monastery, Wutakuji, for the first time, they were absolutely shocked by the ceremonies, the ritual, the chanting, the bowing, and it's in three pillars of Zen, and then I remember he said, what did he say?
He says, "Well, what about burning the Buddha?" And someone said, "Well, you can burn if you want. I'm going to bow," or something like that.
Yeah, or something, the old masters spit on these Buddha images,
Mhm.
and so on. Just said, yeah, spit if you want to. I prefer to bow.
Mhm. Yeah.
So they were, yeah. So they were shocked too.
Mhm.
Oh, you asked me a question.
Yeah. So
Um,
the question was, what's the role of chanting in Zen? Can you give like just a high level overview of chanting and services and the role it plays?
yeah. And I may refer to my book on this because I wrote it some time ago, and it's not all of it is
Mhm.
ready, easy to retrieve.
Mhm.
Well, the way I thought of it is that Zen chanting has different purposes, and I sort of made a list of them.
Mhm.
They're not all. So you might say purpose number one is that it's another form of zazen. It's not seated about zazen, but it's sort of zazen in motion, embodied zazen.
Mhm.
Uh, there's a talk by Bowden Kolheed Roshi on chanting. It's somewhere in the Zen Center files where he talks about chanting in this way. It's just another form of zazen. Mado Moore Roshi definitely, I think, would agree that chanting is another form of zazen and is kind of a yogic practice, and he goes into details uh, that I never heard at Rochester about why and how that is so.
Mhm.
Um, um, uh, so that's one purpose. And I interviewed a number of people about what is chanting for, why do it. Well, first of all, I should make the point that some people don't. Uh,
Mhm.
Sotow's monastery called Anti-Ji in Japan was, and perhaps still is, famous for their zazen without toys
Mhm.
practice, where you just sit.
Oh, they don't have service? I didn't know that.
There's no chanting, there's no service,
Really? I had no idea.
there's
Interesting.
no, you just sit. It sounds like murder. Uh, so they think
Is
things
that
like
true with Okamura Roshi? Where's he in Indiana? Where did he
he
go?
is in that lineage.
Are they in no service as
He
well?
is or was in Bloomington, Indiana.
Yeah.
But I don't know if he would do this, but I don't think he carried on that style except in certain sesshin,
Okay.
because he has a whole book out on the meaning of the chants.
Hmm.
Um, so they don't do it. Tony Packer's group did not do any Zen chanting, and she stopped calling what she was doing Buddhism or Zen at all. It's one big reason for the split with Kapleau. So, and I like Koan Franz's answer. He's the Soto teacher in Nova Scotia. I asked him, say, what's the purpose of chanting? And he said in this sort of classic Zen manner, the purpose of chanting is chanting. Well, that's very helpful, isn't it? I mean, so he did later sort of unpack it a little bit, but that answer sort of could have come out of a cartoon. Um,
Mhm.
so that's one thing, is the chanting is another form of meditate of Zazen, which doesn't really explain why people chant.
Mhm.
I mean, well, okay, you could play croquet. That could be another form of Zazen too. Uh,
Mhm.
almost anything can be another form of Zazen. Why chanting? Um, Another purpose is more utilitarian. It Unlike anti-G's Zazen with their toys, it gives variety to the day. If you sit all day, you're probably going to get pretty stale, or at least you're going to hurt a lot.
Mhm.
And so chanting is sort of adds to the variety. Um, Another purpose that's been brought up is exposure to Buddhist teachings.
Mhm.
Um, Philip Kapleau writes in The Three Pillars, the intoning of sutras while also a mode of zazen also fulfills a further purpose, since they're in the recorded words and sermons of the Buddha. Sutras, to some degree, make a direct appeal to the intellect, sort of subliminally.
Mhm.
So, spreading Buddhist teachings. Um, Another one people brought up was links to tradition. Like, I think how do you pronounce it? Magid? Magid?
Magid. Very Magid.
Magid.
Mhm.
He said, well, it's a way of saying that Zen was not invented in California. There are links to the tradition and the history.
Mhm.
Um, it's a way of expressing gratitude. But historically, I think the main reason for chanting is to generate merit,
Mhm.
generate and convey merit. The chanting will generate merit, and then that merit can be offered to Buddhas, to bodhisattvas, to a particular person who's very ill, to a country that just had an earthquake. Um, and that, I think, is historically the main reason for chanting. And it's also, in the West, the one that uh, there was the least amount of agreement on.
Mhm.
Uh, because all the various teachers I talked to were very leery, some of them were very leery about the idea of generating and conveying merit, because it sounded magical,
Mhm. Well, it is.
superstitious.
It is magical, whether it's true or not. I mean, it's a supernatural activity. You know.
But it's very much a part of Buddhism historically, and most Zen chanting will have an iko, or an ekamen, where you say, the by chanting the Daishin Dharani, or the such and such, we dedicate the merit from chanting the Daihi Shinjiri Dharani to so and so.
Mhm.
And the Soto scholar T. Griffith Folk, who I like very much, mentions that it's this is very this is really the core reason for chanting. And it was D.T. Suzuki who very much de-emphasized it, because he wanted Zen to appeal to the humanistic, rational
Mhm.
character of the West. So he
Mhm.
sort of de-superstitionized it, to coin a very clumsy word. And you know, D.T. Suzuki is vastly influential and important in bringing Zen to the West, and that influence continues.
Mhm.
People will sometimes say, "Oh, D.T. Suzuki's old hat." Suzuki's important. He
Mhm.
remains important, um, and a lot of his opinions continue past him.
Mhm.
So,
Can I ask you a question real quick?
yeah,
So, this is something I've always wondered, and you might know this, and if not, of course, it's okay. But I've noticed at traditional, like the more traditional the chanting is, where it's kind of a longer service and it follows different phases, I've and in watching traditional Soto chanting videos from Japan, they follow this format too. I'll notice that the echo or echo will actually come in the middle of the service. So they always start with the Heart Sutra, then they do some other stuff, and then they do the echo. We say echo where I do it, so I'm just gonna say echo. Um, we do the echo, they do the echo, and then they continue on doing more chanting. Yeah, and like I've seen this at Rinzai places, I've seen this at Soto places. I mean, the traditional ones where they follow traditional pattern. Do you know what that is? Why there's like a pre-echo and a post-echo
Well,
service?
there's often more than one eco. I'm not sure what the correct pronunciation is.
Oh,
There's often more than one in the chanting service.
mhm.
I think in the Diamond Saga morning chanting service, there's at least two. And so I don't think of it as necessarily being one that comes in the middle.
Okay.
Aside from that, I don't know.
Mhm. I was always wondered, like maybe more like Durrani's or something happened after the echo or something.
Um, there's after Durrani's, there's usually is an eco dedicating the merit of chanting the Durrani to
Okay. For
someone, to
yeah.
the founders of the temple, to someone specific, to Buddhas and Bodhisattvas.
Mhm.
Um, and That's really important because that the eco is what conveys the merit to the object. Now, this all sounds very superstitious to people, but it is definitely it's definitely the main reason that people chant. And
Mhm.
T. Griffith Folk thought that sort of ignoring that because it sounds superstitious, saying, oh, it's another form of Zazen, it's a way of connecting with the tradition, is kind of a cop-out.
Mhm.
That's that's the core of it, whether people who chant know it or not, or believe it or not. Um,
Mhm.
but there's a vast amount of disagreement among North Americans and teachers about it. Brad Warner was frankly said, I don't believe this.
Mhm.
Um, Koan Franz was kind of thought it's not as literal as that. Um,
Mhm.
all the way to Ruben Habito, who does believe it, that when you during a chanting service, people will often say, my friend's in the hospital, my friend so and so has just died, and then the eco will come, saying we dedicate the Merivata chanting to these people. He
Mhm.
takes it pretty literally. Um,
Mhm.
and there's a book by a person named Jim Bedard, who was a student of Sunyana Grafe, who was a Kapleau successor at the time, who's kind of basically saying he contracted leukemia and he almost died several times, and he really felt it was the chanting that the Sangha members and Sunyana Grave Roshi had done that really pulled him out a number of times. And
Mhm.
if that sounds like so and so many repetitions of the rosary,
Mhm.
say uh, stopped me from brought me back to health, it's still kind of this similar kind of thing. Uh, and people who try to take the superstition out of Zen, or what they consider superstition, well, that's not really, it is part of Zen.
Mhm. You made me think of Thomas Yuho Krishner. He wrote the Entangling or translated the
Yeah,
Entangling Vines book.
yeah.
So I don't know if you've ever heard any interviews with him or any of his stuff, but he had a
I've heard,
very similar.
I've heard he doesn't have many interviews, but
Yeah,
I've heard two.
yeah, and he didn't want to get interviewed by me, unfortunately. But
Yeah.
he relates where he got really sick. I forget what I think it was cancer. Yeah, and
Well, he said they couldn't diagnose it, I thought, or
well,
maybe
there was
right, maybe it
something,
was
and
cancer.
there was a
There was
big
something.
mass in
Yeah.
his body, and he was extremely sick, um, and then the next time he went to the doctor, it was gone, and he felt better. And he didn't say this, but I wonder if there's some sense that there was I mean, the subtext of it was like it was a supernatural healing of some sort, which Presumably, his friends at the monasteries were chanting on his behalf and so forth.
I don't recall him being that specific about attributing a reason to it.
Well, he doesn't. I'm speculating.
Yeah. There's a really good quote by Folk about this. Let's see. I was supposed to write down the page number. Oh yes, page 25. And 27. Yeah, here he lets people have it. He says Western practitioners of Zen, he's a Soto scholar. He's the one behind the Soto translation uh, project. The people who, among many other things, have, are working on the definitive translation of the Denko-roku.
Mm-hmm.
Western practitioners of Zen sometimes understand that chanting the sutras and dharanis itself to be the main ritual performance. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Okay, this allows those who are uncomfortable with ritual, quote unquote, but happy to practice, quote unquote, to rationalize that the purpose of the chanting is to learn or spread Buddhist doctrines, or in the case of nonsensical dharanis, a device for focusing the mind in meditative concentration. Sound familiar?
Mm-hmm.
Chanting is just another form of Zazen. This underlying assumption that merit is a magical, superstitious, or at best symbolic kind of thing that no rational, scientifically minded person could take seriously as actually existing. In the East Asian Buddhist tradition, of which Japanese Zen is a part, however, people do believe in merit. It is as real to them as, say, money, that other symbolic, magical thing that has no substantial existence, but nevertheless serves to organize human societies and get things done. There's no doubt that the main purpose of sutra chanting services in Zen is the production of merit, and that the formal dedication, the iko, of that merit is the performative heart and defining moment of the ritual.
Mm-hmm.
So that, you can disagree with them, but I think that's pretty much what lets people have it with
Mm-hmm.
both.
It made me think of the context of Buddhist chanting. Actually, is a human activity going back. Was it 4,000 years? It's because the Vedas, well before the Buddha. Even in the Buddha's time, India was not a culture that had writing. It was a completely pre-literate civilization, and thousands of years before that, all the way to the Aryans coming in from the steppes into like the into northern India. You have these Vedas, and the way they were transmitted from generation to generation was chanting, and they and in like certain families, the Brahmins, they would specialize in a certain section, and it was like their family to chant these Vedas. And then when the Buddha came, and he had all these teachings and all his, and again, this is a pre-literate civilization. There's literally no writing. And the way his teachings, the Buddhist teachings, survived beyond the first generation was people would memorize the suttas, or the word of the Buddha, and it would go from generation to generation. And it was a good 500 years until after the Buddha's passing, until they were actually written down. So and it was believed by chanting them and keeping this knowledge alive, you were generating good karma. And the people would donate to the monks who did this, and then they would get merit. It was the quid pro quo was the people donating to the monks. They would get, who would chant, and then that merit would go back to them. I mean, so this is, I'm just kind of, I guess, putting some context. I mean, this chanting is an ancient human activity that and we're keeping it alive.
And part of it's utilitarian, a way to, in a pre-literate society, certainly a way to remember things. I mean, it was said that Ananda had a perfect memory and he could remember all of the Buddha's discourses. But and he kept it going by teaching them to people who would chant them until at some point they were written down. I mean,
Hmm.
that's the idea. So certainly as a way of remembering and conveying, um, and merit is, as you said, tied into that. But it was interesting the way you asked the question, because you said, how did you word it? Yeah, you sent me a list of questions, and this was one of them. Does merit transfer play a role in Western chanting? In your research, did you find people who take it literally?
Hmm.
There's a kind of bias to that second sentence. Like, no one could possibly take it literally, you know?
Hmm.
But this is what Suzuki and the sort of, you get part of the, you didn't want it to sound superstitious.
Hmm.
Um, but but a lot of the American Zen teachers did view it as a suspect and superstitious. There is a whole range. There are people who said nonsense. There are people who kind of hedge their bets, saying, well, maybe merit isn't literally transferred, but it's a buildup of bodhicitta, and it kind of hazy, you know. I'm
Hmm.
not really going to commit myself. And then there are people who are inclined to take it pretty literally.
Hmm.
Um, Rafe was one of them. I mean, not entirely literally necessarily, but he didn't evince the sort of Rafe Martin, the sort of skepticism that some of the other teachers did. But in my book, I found that there was a broad agreement on a lot of things. That on merit, no. That
Hmm.
was a really sensitive issue, which I found really interesting.
We had talked about the break between Yasutani and Capello. And my understanding is, and this may not be accurate, but this is just one telling that was given to me, or maybe I read somewhere, was the big break, or the what initiated the break was Capello translating the chants from Japanese, or I guess Sino-Japanese, to English. So I'm wondering, if did any of your research touch upon translation and the value of it? You know,
Yeah,
what's
yeah,
what are the pros and cons and so forth?
that intrigued me too. And the reasons for the breakup between Kepler Roshi and Yasutani Roshi are, well, once at one point I felt it would be a really good topic to research, but then I found that people are still very, very, very sensitive about it, and it's very easy to offend people, and more has come out since, and there is a Caplo are there's Caplo's archives or Duke University. Maybe there's more there.
Mhm.
Um, but Caplo initially said, it's in his second book, um, Zen Awakening East to West, something like that. He initially said it was because of he had insisted on translating the chants, except the Dharani, which hardly
Mhm.
anyone translates for good reason. Dharani are like magic spells. The sound is very important.
Mhm.
Um, he said it was the fact that he thought it was important to translate the chants to English, and Yasutani was very much against it, that this was the precipitating event. But it's more, I think it's more complicated than that. And Edo Roshi, at that time Edo Taishimano, definitely played a big role in this. That Yasutani liked Edo. Yasutani was studying with Edo while they were overseas, and Kaplo had learned, well, I think probably partly from Aitken Roshi and partly from people he knew who were studying with Ado or had dealt with Ado that there was something wrong. And this certainly played a role.
Mhm.
But your thoughts about translation. Yeah, translation is interesting because well, first of all, there's whether to translate, and then there's, you might say, how to translate.
Mhm.
With whether to translate, the certain things should never be translated, I feel. The Dharani, like the Daishin Dharani, for instance, or the Dharani to prevent disasters. They were written in a kind of a combination of Sanskrit and some other Indic languages. And although one can, I think, come to some sort of vague translation, and I don't know these languages, bear that in mind. The point of Dharani is not the meaning, but the sounds. They're like magic spells.
Mhm.
You don't think of the meaning as you chant them. And I think, and there, some people in America have translated them, and I don't think the effect is very good. I think it's a kind of misunderstanding. So with mantras and dharanis, I think they should never be translated. Or if you want to come to some sort of vague translation, don't chant it. It's something you can look at, you can study, and you can refer to it, but you shouldn't chant them.
Yeah, like the Kanzeon seems very awkward chanted.
You know,
Some
the
people say.
Kanzeon is not a dharani. It's written in, it's
It's a
chanted
mantra,
in
though,
a,
right?
well, it contains a mantra.
Uh-huh.
Or as noted, the Heart Sutra contains a mantra. The Kanzeon doesn't. The Kanzeon Sutra is very mantra-like.
Mhm.
And no, it's very like a Dharani somehow. The experience of chanting it is very like a Dharani, and that's interesting because when I came to Rochester, initially it was chanted in Japanese only. Um, um, I mean, it's in Sino-Japanese only, and it chanted very well. It just sort of rolled off the tongue. You could really get into it. It contains a lot of internal repetition. Um, let's take a look at it. Uh, hold on, I'm finding it. Um, wait a minute, I've got it in here somewhere. Uh, I used to have it memorized, but I couldn't swear to it now.
Mhm.
Um, well, in Sino-Japanese, it's Kanze namu butsu yo butsu and yo butsu and bopo so and jo rakaga chonen kanzeon nennen jushinkin nennen furishin, and then you do that a number of times, like 8 or 10 times, and it's just great to chant.
And you speed up every time, or at least
Well,
that's the way we
some
would do it.
people do. At
Yeah,
Rochester, they didn't. And
yeah.
it's got a lot of internal repetition. Yo butsu and yo butsu and nen jushinki, nen furishin. It's, you can really get into it. You're not
Mhm.
thinking of the meaning.
Mhm.
You're really, so it's very much like a Dharani. Now, soon after I got there, Rochester stopped chanting in Japanese. They started chanting in English. Kanze on praise to Buddha, all are one with Buddha, all awake to Buddha, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, eternal, joyous, selfless, pure, through the day, Kanze on, etc. And it's not the same. I think it just
Mhm.
loses, sure, you get some meaning from it, but it loses the power, you know?
I agree. Yeah.
You can always get into a trance state, yeah, with the sound. So it's very much like a Dharani. And So those things I wouldn't translate. Things like recitations, Hakuin's chant in praise of Zen, for instance, I
Mhm,
would translate that.
mhm,
It's people always do translate it in my experience.
mhm.
Um,
Yeah, the one place they don't, where they don't translate anything that I've been is Daishu and West up in Humboldt County in Northern California.
yeah, and I think,
And
hmm,
yeah, they're in the and I recognize and I could just tell by the name, like, oh, this is the song of Zaza. You would never know it by the chant. But anyway, like there, so they do, choka, Rinzai does chanting the first thing in the morning, where a lot of soda places you sit and then you chant. But your first activity in the morning after getting out of bed is you go to the Dharma hall or whatever and you chant. And there, I spend the whole time just looking through the book trying to figure out where in the hell we are, because they don't stop. They just go. But even with that kind of confusion, um, there's something very percussive about their chanting. That's I think you mentioned trance-inducing this. It's almost like a shamanistic type of thing that I don't get from more traditional Western services that are translated. But the corollary to that, and I'll make my point quick, is occasionally when I'm, especially Soto places where we're chanting portions of the Dogen stuff, occasionally we'll get to a line, and I'm almost doing it phonetically, where I'm not really thinking of the meaning. I'm just kind of saying the words. But like occasionally, like we'll get to a sentence, and it'll just hit me like in a way it would never hit me, almost like a koan, where it just like it comes like an embodied, like outflowing, that would never if I was just reading it. There's something about the group activity and seeing it in that context where the meaning will just like it's like a laser beam into my brain. And so I kind of see both.
no, this is chanting in Sino-Japanese.
um I was comparing and contrasting. The first one is chanting in Sino-Japanese, but then I was saying, where like the shamanistic kind of mantric, it's almost like trance inducing in a way that I don't get with the translated stuff. But the advantage of the translated is, occasionally some of the lines will just hit me in a really heavy way that would be impossible with the untranslated, because I don't understand it.
Yeah.
So I can kind of see the pros and cons there.
So this is interesting. One is whether to translate, and the other is what kind of translation. Now we're on the whether to translate. So
Right.
some things like Dharani, the Kanzeon mantras, I think should never be translated.
Hmm.
Um, there are other things um, which are more didactic, perhaps,
Hmm.
that can. And the interesting thing is that Aitken Roshi went back and forth on this. When the Kanzeon, uh, they would the Diamond Sangha would chant it in Japanese. And as an experiment, he tried an English version. And he said that experiment lasted one day.
Hmm.
Everyone hated it, and they went back to the Sino-Japanese version. But then, about 10 years after that, he wrote saying it's important to know the meaning. So it's important to know the meaning of what you recite. So they settled on, I guess, sort of interspersing or alternating a Japanese repetition with an English repetition, or
Hmm.
Sino-Japanese with the English repetition. At Pat Hawk's place, we did in Sino-Japanese, but the English translation was printed on the right. You didn't chant
Okay.
it, but you could see it.
Interesting.
And so Aitken Roshi sort of went back and forth on this. Um, now, John Winter or someone, Luke Winter, who has I think, a sangha in Brussels. He said there are members of his sangha from like, seven different. They speak seven different languages.
Hmm.
So instead of trying to translate, well, if they translated, what would they translate to? So they leave everything in Sino-Japanese because it's the only neutral language.
Hmm.
Uh, um, so I think it's kind of a trade-off, and it depends on the type of chant. But then another interesting thing is the style of the translation. If you are going to translate to the vernacular, not always to English, and in Montreal, everything's translated into French.
Mm-hmm.
And this I found interesting too, is that Rochester was known when Rochester translated things into English, and they translated most things into English. Capello really stressed chantability, quote unquote, quote, something that would flow easily off the tongue.
Mm-hmm.
Aitken stressed meaning, as precise meaning.
Mm-hmm.
So Aitken's translations, which is mainly what the Diamond Sangha does, might be precise, but they're not easy to chant. But Rochester is very easy to chant, although the meaning might be not as precise. And part of my book is about this, where I compare the translations. It depends on where you put the emphasis. So with the Heart Sutra, yeah, here's the beginning of the Aitken translation of the Heart Sutra. Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, practicing deep prajna paramita, clearly saw that all five skandhas are empty, transforming anguish and distress. The Rochester version is the Bodhisattva of compassion, from the depths of prajna wisdom, saw the emptiness of all five skandhas and sundered the bonds that caused all suffering. It just rolls. It's just easier to say.
Mm-hmm.
And that's no accident. Rochester places a great premium on this. So there are different, and I'm speaking as someone who doesn't know the languages. Someone like Dosho Port can speak more authoritatively about translation. But I think the emphases, if you're going to translate, the emphases of your style of translation make a big difference.
Mm-hmm. Where do you come down on this, debate, so to speak? Do you?
Oh, I like the Rochester.
Mm-hmm.
Well, first of all, like I said, there's something like the Kanon, the Meijiku Kanon. I vastly prefer the original. I think more things should be left in the original. Someone like, as you say, Daishoin West,
Mm-hmm.
or I've heard that Joshi Sasaki would never translate anything. At Korenji, Meido Moroshi's place, things are not translated. You can
Mm-hmm.
study translations, but you chant everything in the original.
Mm-hmm.
Something to do with partly the mantric resonances of the original Sino-Japanese. He talks about it in his books.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember that with the ancestral line, the back then they called it the patriarchal line, at Rochester, it used to be that you would say like Shakyamuni Dayasho. There's like Bodhi Dharma Dayasho, so and so Dayasho, and Dayasho had this sort of calypso swing.
Mm-hmm.
Da 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 da. You sort of like a dance, like da 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 da. It was marvelous to chant. Everyone was swaying back and forth with this sort of 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 3. It was so fun. And then of course it was too fun. And so they translated it, they did away with Dayasho and
Mm-hmm.
changed to honored one. Bodhi Dharma, honored one, da 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 da, honored one, Haku Nikako, honored one. But it doesn't swing like it did.
Mm-hmm.
I felt it's not fun anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Uh it was better in the original.
Mm-hmm.
Uh
The San Francisco Zen Center, they still do the Daya show.
yeah, dice shows in English it's a fun word. Da 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 da. Um
Have you?
so I aside from that, I'm firmly on the side of Rochester, and that the chantability, the ease of saying the words is important. I think is important.
Mhm. Have you encountered, and I think I remember reading about it in your book. I don't remember what you say about it though. Shasta Abbey and that tradition, they stand out as, idiosyncratic in that they sing it in almost like a, what are those monks that sing it's like a choir singing the way they do.
They sing it in Gregorian chant and an Anglican chant.
Hmm.
It's a very interesting. The G.U. Kennett was raised like, I guess, most Christians in England, and certainly in that time, in the Anglican Church.
Hmm.
Anglican Church has its own style of polyphonic, multi-voiced chanting, as well as the monophonic, the single line Gregorian chant. So her way, and she says that her Soto teacher told her she must westernize Soto Zen.
Hmm.
Well, she took that to mean anglicize, make English, um, not American necessarily, but English, uh, Soto Zen. So her way, and so to chant in the Japanese manner would be too foreign. So she's sort of operating the assumption that Zen ritual should be as Anglican as possible.
Hmm.
Uh, so she arranged, and her students arranged all of these Buddhist chants and ceremonies to fit this Anglican church style, um, which is very pretty and also extraordinarily weird. Uh,
Hmm.
so Henry Schuckman told me that listening to it was just like being carried back to his days as a boy in church in England, kind of old and fusty. Uh, so that was her way of westernizing Zen ritual,
Hmm.
was to make it, well, essentially Anglican.
Do they still do that at Shasta?
Yes, yes, they do. They're the only ones that do it, but
Uh-huh.
they're, I think, a big organization with a number of monasteries and temples, and
Hmm.
they take great pride in keeping to that style and adapting new chants and the kind of English they translate it into is a sort of almost kind of theosophical style English. It's just this sort of style that it's not a modern style at all. It's all,
That's a really interesting adjective, theosophical.
yeah, the kind of vocabulary. Theosophy was a big thing, in the early part of the 20th century.
Hmm.
So there's something very unique and sort of old-fashioned about it. So that's another way. The early Western Zen pioneers, in their own way, were felt that Americanizing or Westernizing Zen was within without destroying it or compromising it was important, especially the ritual.
Hmm.
Um, but they came up with various solutions, um, and that was hers.
Hmm.
It didn't catch on because it was so idiosyncratic, but it's certainly still true uh, in her organization.
What's interesting to me is, you know, probably the first 1,000 services I heard were in Japanese lineage places. Whether even if it's all in English, it's there's places derived from Japan. I was really struck when I was there's this big Chinese Buddhist monastery called City of 10,000 Buddhas
I've heard of it.
near Ukiah. You know, when I lived in Humboldt, I used to travel back and forth to the Bay Area all the time, and we'd always stop at the vegan restaurant there on the grounds, and a couple times. And in recent years, I'd still stop there. Um, but one time I showed up when they were doing their service. They have this literally, it's like a giant Buddha hall with literally 10,000 Buddhas in the wall, and there's a giant Kanan Avalokiteshvara multi-hand statue is it's very different than the Buddhism I've experienced. But anyway, I was there when they were doing their service, and the way they were doing it was they were circumventing. What's the word?
Circumventing is right.
Yeah, I can't think.
No, you're thinking of circumambulating.
Yeah, circumambulating. That's the word I'm trying to think. So they're doing the giant hall, and they're holding their rosaries. If I remember, the monks and the nuns, they do separate services. So I think this was just the nuns, and I was really surprised how sing-songy it was. I mean, it was actually hauntingly beautiful. It's reverberating through the hall, and I remember thinking, like, this is so different than the Japanese style, percussive kind of almost, the same note over and over and over again. But they were like singing it beautifully. It was like angelic sounding, and it was. I don't really have a point other than it was just interesting to see the difference. And on the other extreme, you have the Rinzai chanting where it's like harsh sounding. And yeah. But it was just interesting to me to see the chanting from a different culture and how different it was.
I don't know much about, and I haven't listened much to Korean or to Chinese or other or Thai or the Vietnamese chanting, but I think it tends to be much more melodic than the sort of Japanese derived chanting we do in the West. But there is another sort of chanting which is quite different from anything we do in Western Zen centers, which is Japanese, and it's called shomyo. Shomyo is not part of the repertoire of Western Zen centers, and it's not what I studied or wrote about, but shomyo is different. Shomyo is extremely melodic, extremely melismatic. I mean, American Zen chanting tends to be on a single note or thereabouts. But shomyo has its own scales, its own Japanese scales, and it's used largely for elaborate services and rituals in Soto, in Tendai, a few other sects. And it's quite different from the kind of utilitarian syllabic chanting that we do in Western Zen centers. So the Japanese tradition has that too, but it's much harder and it's more complicated. And I mean, I think the Japanese word for chanting just means sutra chanting. That's all. It's just a way of chanting sutras. It's used for other things in sutras, but I think that's basically the meaning. So what you're talking about does exist in Japan, a more complicated, more melodic form of chanting.
Would this take part by monks during the service, or is this a separate activity altogether?
I know very little about it. I think it's used for certain rituals.
I was reading this book. This guy, he was actually an anthropologist, I think, spent a couple years at Shojiji, one of the two head monasteries in the Soto sect. The one being Eheji and the other Shojiji, and so and he talked about like basically different slices of life at the monastery, and one of the ones, and so there were the monks, and they would do, they'd wake up and they do 25 minutes of zazen, and then they go do an hour long service, and then they go have breakfast. But the other music in the monastery was actually a group of lay people, and I think mostly women, and they would do this traditional singing, and I'm wondering if that's what you're talking about. I could probably don't have time to look it up right now.
I don't know. A
Yeah.
book came out a few years ago by Michaela Ross, Mross, on Shomyo in a specific Soto ritual. One is that there's not that common. I have the book in the other room. If you look up Michaela, Michaela Mross, Mross, you'll see
Mm-hmm.
it. Most of the scholarly work that's been done on Zen chanting is about Shomyo.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the ethnomusicological work.
Mm-hmm.
What is different from about my book is that it's about kind of the run of the mill uh, American way that chanting is used in Zen centers in Zen in the West,
Mm-hmm.
which I think most scholars would feel it's too simple. What's there right about that? Shomyo was much more complicated. There's more to say.
Mm-hmm.
But I found that the the dokyo, as I call it, the sutra chanting, is actually quite interesting if you look at the way it's been adapted in multiple very different ways in the West. And even in Japan, I'm sure there are different styles. It's
Mm-hmm.
not uniform.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Certainly between Soto and Rinzai, very different. And it's
yeah, for one thing, Rinzai is very, very fast. Soto
yeah.
does tend to be very, very slow. One interesting thing, and there's been a lot of experiments done in Pacific, in John Tarrant's place, Pacific Zen what?
Pacific Zen Institute.
Zen Institute,
Yeah.
PZI. Then it's gone, a lot of their chants were arranged by, uh, what's his name? Dominga, um, a member who was a musician who had his Zydeco Cajun band. So he arranged all of the chants in a sort of Zydeco Cajun um, style. And there are recorded versions of the Heart Sutra and the other chants, and that's very different with a lot of blues in there too, and that's applying much more of a specific type of Western style to the
Mm-hmm.
chants.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, Geocanix is a different solution. Dane and Henry came up with a totally different type of kind of wild arrangement of the chants, which I write about in the book. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's not just like a single note, but just kind of parts of it goes into chords,
Mm-hmm.
which no one else but Denver Zen Center did, and I don't know if they still do it. Um, um, and even the Japanese chanting, you tend to think of it, one tends to think of it as being just a single note.
Mm-hmm.
But if you listen to recordings like on YouTube from Myoshinji, um, they're not just singing one note. Everyone sort of has their own pitch, and it vacillates and varies and changes so that sort of the total chords keep on changing. So it's actually very, very complicated. Um, and it's far more complicated than sort of the way people chanted in the West in the 70s, where everyone was trying to get a single note or
Mm-hmm.
chanting in thirds or in major chords, which tends to be very monotonous and very boring and it needs more randomness to it. So, one thing I noticed when I was at the training program at Rochester, and we would have, quote, chanting practice, unquote, is that people would chant in thirds, major thirds. And thirds are a very sweet interval. They're a component of major and minor chords.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't do it on purpose. They just did it automatically. But it makes the chanting sound very saccharine. Um, but that's so you get into all of these little details. So the chanting is not as uniform as people think it is, either in the US, certainly not in the US, but I don't think is as uniform as people think it is in Japan either.
Mhm.
Koan Franz told me that different places he's practiced sort of have their own style
In Japan.
in Japan. So
Mhm.
it's not like there's a monolithic style in Japan and then that kind of fractured in America and everyone started doing their own thing. Maybe it's not as monolithic as we think in Japan either.
Yeah, I've heard that it's Shojiji and Eheji both have differences in their both their ceremonies and their the way they do sutras.
Yeah, so
And, by the way, that I looked up real quick, that singing style I was talking about in the book
hmm.
about Shojiji is called Goeka music.
Oh, that's a different genre.
Yeah,
Those are like
that's what I
those are
was
like
thinking.
Buddhist songs.
Yeah, and then at least at Shojiji at the time they wrote that book. So it's a really interesting book if you're curious about kind of like the sociology of Zen. But
What's it called?
the full name of it is let me go to the title page. It's Sojiji, Discipline, Compassion, and Enlightenment at a Japanese Zen Temple by Joshua A. Izari.
Did you send me the citation? I've
Yes,
never
I will.
heard of it.
Yeah,
Sounds interesting.
yeah. Um, it's a Kindle available book too. Um, so is there anything worth talking about with the instruments used in chanting? You know, I know like there's the makugyo, there's the big bell, there's the small bell. I mean, is it?
It's a kind of a steady collection. Japan got them from China.
Mhm,
There's the mokugyo, which is the fish drum. It's
mhm,
a wooden drum in the shape of a fish, and you pound on it with a felt covered mallet.
mhm,
And they come in different sizes. All these things come in different sizes. There's the keisu, which is the sort of bowl-shaped bell,
mhm,
which um that sound will linger, a bell sound, for a long, long time. That comes in different sizes. There's the inking bell, which is also used to start and stop a period of zazen. That's sort of a piercing timbre. Taku are the wood blocks with a very percussive sound. Taiko is the big drum.
mhm,
And then there are taiko ensembles that have nothing to do with Buddhism per se, where the men are always stripped to the waist and tend to be very muscular, pounding away. Um, and there's the han, the which is a piece of wood, uh, kind of long, suspended with on both sides. Typically, there's an inscription on it. It's the same inscription,
mhm.
and it gets worn away as it's hit with the wooden hammer. So the old Hans, well, they lose more and more wood, and eventually they have to be replaced. One of the things in my book was comparing translations of the inscription on the Han, different English translations.
Life and death comes quick. Don't waste time, or something along that line.
Yeah, yeah. And I look at like 3 or 4 different translations, and um, I don't know the Japanese original, but the translations are very different. Some are very sparse and to the point.
Mhm.
Uh, the Rochester Zen Center one was like that. Um, um, yeah, great is the matter of birth and death. Life slips quickly by. Time waits for no one. Wake up. Don't waste a moment. Uh, and then there was Dosho ports. spoken to the great assembly, the great matter, birth, death, impermanence is swift. It's fitting for everyone to sober up, wake up. Do not let this opportunity pass by, which is, I guess, more Chinesian, but it's, to me, less idiomatic to English.
Dosho, in his translations in general, I think he goes for accuracy over readability or sayability. I found.
Yeah, I think, and we've talked before. He knows, he can read Chinese, and I can't. So but I do think that in his attempt to be accurate to the Chinese, he comes up sometimes with translations that are less idiomatic in English. Whereas Aitken, and certainly Rochester, might be less true to the original meaning, but they speak better. They speak better. They're more idiomatic in this language. I mean, that's my kind of apologize to Dosho, but I actually sort of say that in the book, comparing these translations. And then there's a third one, which is from Ruben Habito's Maria Kanon Zen Center. I humbly proclaim before the Sangha, resolving the matter of life and death is of prime importance. Everything bears the mark of impermanence. Everything passes quickly by like a fleeting arrow. Let everyone be mindful every moment. Now compare that to the Rochester Center. Great is the matter of birth and death. Life slips quickly by. Time waits for no one. Wake up, don't waste a moment. Rubens is pretty florid. It's full of long words, kind of longer ways to say things. It doesn't, the effect is quite ornate. So I thought that was interesting. Even if you translate things into English, the style of the translation can vary greatly. And that will create a different, I mean, Rochester always liked to pack a punch. It always liked to be to the point, keep the word short, no extra syllables, Rubens is almost Victorian.
Right.
I'm not sure where he got his translation from. I don't know if he made it himself. Doshos seem accurate, but sort of
terse.
Sort of Chinesian,
Which is terse, right?
Yeah, it's.
Oh, sorry.
One interesting thing about the matter of translating these things is that it's been pointed out by T. Griffith Folk and by other people that in Japan, the typical Japanese cannot understand anything that is said in a Zen chant because they're being chanted in a kind of Sino-Japanese. And even the monks don't know the meaning of what is being chanted from the sound of the words. So, but if they can read the kanji, the Chinese characters, they will know the meaning because they have nothing to do with the pronunciation. So in Japanese chant books, you get the kanji, you get the Chinese ideographs, but by each ideograph is the Japanese phonetic pronunciation, hiragana or katakana. The monks are reading the phonetic Japanese notation. This is something that who's the monk at Daishu in West? Shakyu.
Yeah, Shakyu Kyoju.
Yeah, something he talked about in his interview. So the monks, these are just as foreign sounds to the Japanese monks as to us.
Interesting.
And there's an incident that Aiken mentioned where describes where Nakagawa Soen meets with maybe it's a Chinese abbot, and they get together to recite the Heart Sutra. Neither of them could understand what either of them were saying. But because they were reading from the same Chinese ideographs, they started together and they finished together and they knew what it meant.
Hmm.
So this comes down to the fact that in English, there's no standardization in the translations. Everyone has their own translation. But in Japan or China, even though the sounds may be unintelligible or archaic, if you know the meaning of the kanji, you know what it means, and everyone has the same kanji as far as I know.
Hmm.
Perhaps they don't, but you get the idea. So that's another dimension. Um, there is no central in the West. There's no central authority, like the central authority in Soto Zen is what's the name?
Sotoshu.
Hmm?
Sotoshu.
Yeah, there's nothing like that. People have their own house translations, and of course in Rinzai there's nothing like Sotoshu, but I think there's still much more standardization. So the situation in the West is much more when it comes to the chants, more kind of Wild West. Uh, and people have come out like Kaz Tanahashi came out with what he hoped would be an authoritative English translation of the Zen chants, which people could adopt.
Hmm.
But they didn't. They just kept, doing their own thing.
Hmm.
So I find that another interesting dimension of things.
Great. Um, so I think maybe this is a good stopping point. I was hoping we would play some. We would get to playing some sutras. So can we do an addendum where we maybe record a part two where we talk about some individual chants and play them? Would you be up for
We
that?
could do that as an audio only file because
Okay.
it's too cumbersome to turn the share on and off and on and off again.
Okay. So
Um,
yeah. So I'll reach out to you, and then we can schedule something for that.
yeah, we could do some comparisons of different
Okay.
styles and different versions. I don't have a lot of audio files of the same thing, but I do have enough that I
Mhm.
think it would be interesting if people are interested in this kind of thing at all.
I think so. I know at least one person would be, and that's me. So let's do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
Okay.
thank you so much.
Well, I don't know how it's come off, but I've had a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, me too. And if people want to get a hold of you, is it through Facebook or your faculty page?
You
What's
can do it through
best?
Facebook. Slotow is
Uh,
not a common name,
uh,
although there are members of my extended. It's more common that so they can do it through Facebook, or they can go to the College of Music, University of North Texas
mhm.
website, look under faculty, and you'll get my UNT, University of North Texas, um, email address.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this, and I greatly appreciate your time.
Oh, it's like I said, it's I've thoroughly enjoyed myself, and we'll talk about part two.
Great. Thank you.
An addendum, something a bit different towards the musical side.
Great. Thank you.
Hey, thank you.